mitochondria were bacteria once, and the membrane which has got the charge on it is the membrane that was the interface between the inside world and the outside world. And if a bacterial cell wants to know how it's doing, it's somehow got to integrate all of this chemistry, this billion reactions a second, into a single readout, and that readout can be the membrane potential. That's telling you something about how you're doing in relation to the world, and that's what you're playing with an anesthetic in relation to the mitochondria. So there's an interesting way into the question, and from my point of view, I have nothing to add about neural networks or computation or any of those standard neurology questions. I can never remember the structure of the brain and all of these different regions. It does my head in. But it struck me for a long time that the depolarization of a neuron giving rise to feelings of things. So the hard problem, it's usually called the idea of qualia, of feelings, of that we feel something. Why would potassium ions or sodium ions or calcium ions coming into a cell give rise to a feeling of anything at all? What is a feeling in physical terms? And again, I think a lot of people back away as soon as you start asking those questions because it feels like it's not really science.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think most biologists would agree that the feelings are real, which is to say they're not a complete fabrication. They're something that we can see in animals. We can see in ourselves. We can tell. We understand our own emotions from within. So I think most people would agree that they're real. And if they're real, I think most people would agree again that they evolved by natural selection. We primarily have feelings about ourselves in relation to the environment. Are we good or are we bad? Or how are we doing here? We're not primarily conscious of the movements of the stars or the heavens or of celestial beings, or we're conscious that we've got tummy ache or whatever it might be. It's very physical, and it's very much about organism in an environment. So it's about the organisms. It evolved by selection. I don't think many biologists would disagree with that. They're real and therefore physical. And if they're physical, we should be able to measure them. And if we can't measure them, then we have a problem. And I don't think that there's anything that we know about neural nets or the function of the mind that explains why this pattern of neural firing is associated with conscious awareness, and this very similar pattern of neural firing is unconscious or subconscious or whatever it may be.
Yes.
It seems to be the wrong level of analysis. We don't seem to be able to distinguish between different types of network at the network level. And when I come back to thinking about bacterial cells, which I'm far more comfortable with now, and I think, okay, I've got a cell, it's an oblong, it's got metabolism in it. Outside, we've got an environment. The environment is harsh in this way. It perturbs metabolism in that way. Metabolism is now not generating a membrane potential in the same way, and that's giving me a kind of an integrated feedback on my position in relation to the world. Is that what a feeling is?
Yeah.
In physical terms, is it something to do with the electrical charges on the membrane being modulated? Possibly something to do with electromagnetic fields as well, in the sense that the charge is being produced by the movement of charge. So we have an electrostatic charge across the membrane being generated by movement of charge, movement of electrons, movement of protons, and so on in pretty strictly defined ways. So there's a lot of information that you have in those about your state in relation to the world. So why would that give you useful information? I think it would give you useful information because if the whole thing was automated, and you respond to your environment by changing your phosphorylation state, by changing your gene expression, by upregulating chaperone proteins and a stress response, whatever it may be. So you're responding automatically to your change in state. How do you know whether that's going to be good enough or not? should you have stayed or should you have gone?
Right.
And as soon as you start changing those things, you're no longer in the state that you were before. You're now in a different state. So have I done enough? Do I need to keep doing more? When do I stop? And how far have I come already if I can't remember the previous state that I was in? So you're messing up the situation all the time by changing in response to it. And so if you want to know how am I doing right now, you kind of need to have an immediate answer. Like, it doesn't have to be a perfect answer. It needs to be an approximate answer. I'm okay, stay, or I'm no good, go. In which case, a certain membrane potential is giving you that information before you've had a chance to respond to your environment internally. And if you can do something about it, like move, power up your flagellum, which is proton powered, by the way, and paddle over there, then you've got agency. You've sensed your environment. You had a physical response at the level of membrane potential that tells you how your metabolism is in relation to that environment before you had time to do anything about it. And that said, oh dear, power up the flagellum and paddle over there. So that state, that membrane potential, the electrical charges seem to give you this information and could potentially be the physical states that we associate with feelings. Obviously, they're hugely embellished in the central nervous system, and
Yes.
I'm not trying to explain everything here. It's just what is the physical basis underpinning it. It seems to me to relate to metabolism and charge and fields and those kind of things. And another kind of really interesting and important thing then about that is it relates to the wetware of metabolism. It relates to the survival of organisms. It relates to integrating your state in relation to the environment in terms of your wetware. And so an AI, even if it's robotic and self-aware and all of those things, is not necessarily going to have it's a very different substrate. It's not necessarily going to have feelings in the way that I suspect animals would.
Your position reminds me of Anil Seth, who I think I've gotten most of my ideas about consciousness from. I think he nicely summarizes consciousness as a subjective experience of being that thing. So when a group of bacteria receive and they sense some stimulus in the environment and they react, are they reacting in a subjective sense? Are they all reacting in a similar way?
I think it's kind of inevitably subjective, and I kind of agree with Anil Seth, and also in terms of feelings and emotions and the difference between them with Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Yes.
And she makes a distinction between a feeling as a kind of very low-grade report, interoceptive report of bodily organ state, and an emotion as an interpretation of that feeling in the context of the cerebral hemisphere processing of,
yes,
oh God, there's a tiger over there, or whatever it may be, and you put the two things together and project into the world your state. What should you do about it? So it's kind of interpretation of interoceptive signals, but the feeling then is those interoceptive signals reporting back on bodily organ state, which in the end is reporting back on the metabolic perturbation of those organs. And I like the way that Anil Seth thinks about this in terms of effectively a kind of Bayesian probability of this. Is this the right answer? Change this a little bit, do another take. Does it still look like the right answer? So you're kind of constructing the world that's out there by continually questioning what's out there. I think that this kind of approach is true of bacterial cells as well. I think the same. Maybe it's inappropriate to use the same words, but we don't have better words for it.
Yes,
so you find yourself
fails.
echoing the terminology of neurology to talk about a bacterial cell, which feels mad, but it's the same problems they face.
Yes. So then would you be comfortable in saying that bacteria are maybe not conscious in the same way that we are? They're definitely not conscious to the same extent, but there is, it's a spectrum of consciousness, and it's about how much consciousness, and they likely do have some subjective experience of what it is like to be that bacteria, even though to the human brain we can't empathize with that, we can't understand that, but it's likely that that's the case.
I don't imagine that they would have any self-awareness as such. The problem with consciousness is this, it means all things to all people.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about consciousness in any way that most people would understand it as relating to a human being. But is there a kind of a quantum of a feeling in a bacterial cell trying to integrate its state in relation to the environment as a readout of your metabolic wetware, as a charge and movement of charge on a membrane? Yes, I think that they would have feelings in that sense, and it may be as simple as good or bad, go or stay. But I the question, the kind of bigger question behind it is, if feelings evolved, then what was being selected, and what is the simplest form that was being produced by cells or organisms anyway that was capable of being selected by natural selection? And as I said, if it's a physical state, then what is that physical state, and what is it telling you about your environment? So all of this, it's just thinking. I don't like the word speculation, because it is speculation, but it's testable speculation, and so it's hypothesis. Let's grace it with the word hypothesis.
Yes.
But it's kind of logic from what we know about how bacteria and organisms behave, and I was left. My impulse was to then say that consciousness, or at least feelings, are a property of all living things, but not a property of suns, and not a property. I don't really subscribe to the idea that the universe is conscious, to the kind of panpsychism ideas. I tend to think of it as primarily as a process of life, of living things, and dependent on the substrate of living things, so the wetware of metabolism and so on. But then you're still faced with this question of what does it do, and what's it for, and how does it get selected? And my answer to those is that, well, it's about trying to understand how you're doing in relation to the environment through a single readout that tells you immediately I'm doing well or I'm doing badly, which is a physical state of charge and fields associated with that charge. I don't know how cells are picking up on that and responding to that. It's not that I've not got an answer to half the questions that these raise, but I think that way of thinking about it has the potential to say, well, here is the minimum possible imaginable feeling, I'm good or I'm bad. Here's what it is physically. Here's how it becomes incorporated into a more complex cell. Here's how you end up in the central nervous system, and so on. And underneath it all, there has to be some correlation between what the organs are telling you about your state and your actual state. Just as with perception of a tree or a lion or whatever it may be, there is, even though we're projecting it and we're trying to conjure our understanding of the world into existence by projecting it out into the environment, we have an input of photons, we have an input of sound and whatever it is, and there's some objective basis, even if it's a very flawed objective basis. There is an input that we need to interpret, but it was a physical input.
Yes.
And I think feelings in that sense are a physical interoceptive input about the status of the organisms, grounded in the metabolism of those organs. And then the question is, how does the system know how those organs are doing? What was the readout that said my kidneys are in trouble here, as it feeds back somehow to the central nervous system?
I think that's a really cool mental model of consciousness that I haven't really heard vocalized in exactly that way. A single readout of kind of the state of the body. It sort of reminds me a little bit, I'm very unfamiliar with these ideas, like Carl Friston's free energy principle.
Yes.
That's what sort of rings in my mind, but I'm unfamiliar. Maybe you'd be better at sort of explaining that, because
I've discussed
cool ideas, but
these things with Carl Friston and with people like Anil Seth. And yes, I mean, Carl does think about single cell, but mostly he thinks about the central nervous system, and he's a neurologist by training, but he generalizes the free energy principle down to the level of cells and even back to the origin of life. And it's quite mathematically complex.
Yes.
And it's not something that I've really tried to get to grips with in a very serious way, but at a kind of a superficial grasp of what he's saying. It's really about how does an internal system, which is separated from the external system, that changes in the external world will change the internal system in its own way. And that is almost by definition subjective, because it's the internal system which is changing. And that the change in the internal system, you need to project it back into the outside world to try and understand what did it mean? What did it happen? It's really very deeply built into the way I think that most neurologists think about how an organism constructs a kind of hypothesis as to its situation.
Yeah.
What environment am I in? Am I in danger here? Am I not in danger? And is it good or is it bad? It's very linked up, I think. It's a formal mathematical way of seeing that question. And I think it applies to cells. Yes, I think it applies to bacteria.
It's so cool. I'm also a huge fan of Peter Godfrey Smith's work on consciousness. Huge fan. Talking to him in a couple of weeks. I think he's done just his like Other Minds as a book. I think did an incredible job at expanding the consciousness conversation beyond humans. But he has a really interesting example. You know, I'm really interested in this question of like, where is the line, and how as you get more complex organisms, how does consciousness become greater or lesser in different ways? And he has a really interesting example of an ant. You know, one conscious experience that we share is if we both got punched in the face, we would react differently. If you did MMA your whole life, you would react in a very different way to me. So pain is a subjective experience. It's a conscious experience based on our past experiences.
Yeah.
And if you tear a leg off an ant, it doesn't actually seem to act in any way that's different. It seems to just be completely normal, according to Peter in his book, Other Minds, not an expert in ants. So that would seem to me that they don't have a conscious experience of pain, or at least in that way, or doesn't have a conscious experience of pain in that area, which is an interesting...
Having said that, I saw a picture, funnily enough, today just online. I've got no idea really any of the context of it, but it was a picture of an ant that had its leg pulled off, and there was another ant that was effectively dressing the wound in some way. It appears to was it licking the wound? Was it putting some antiseptic down? I don't know what it was doing,
Wow.
and I don't know if this was a fair. But I just saw this picture and thought, wow.
Yeah, they do they do weird things.
Is it in pain as well? I don't know. Not obviously, but it's interesting that the other ant is obviously aware that it's lost a leg and is doing something about it, and this first ant is standing there and allowing it to be done. So there must be more understanding of that predicament than you would have just from a purely kind of unthinking entity.
My understanding is that they communicate a lot through pheromones, and you can sprinkle a pheromone that they release when they die onto a live ant, and other ants will come up and pick it up and bring it back to the nest and kind of bury it, or kind of have like some sort of burial ritual, even though the ant is actively moving and alive. So the pheromone signal they're receiving is overacting any. And they can also find themselves in death walks, right? If there's a circle of the pheromone, they can find themselves trapped in the circle, and they'll just walk until they die. So that they're just trapped in a signal which says like move forward, move forward, move forward, and they're just forever in this algorithm. So to me, that seems very limited consciousness. Those seem like algorithms. If this, then this. If that seems like executing very simple steps, but perhaps it's conscious in ways that we don't perceive, and it almost certainly is.
Yes, I mean, I don't really have much to say to that.
Yeah, I just think it's cool. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a fair amount of algorithmic behavior, but again, your perception of the world, you've got some sense which is coming in, which says this pheromone is overwhelming, this pheromone is a death pheromone, this ant is dead. And you also have the perception of your eyes that saying, it's moving. And then you probably, is there any processing going on? And well, it's moving, but maybe it's in a death throw or something. It's definitely dead. The pheromone tells me it's dead. You've got some conflict going on. There. You've got conflict between algorithms telling you different things, and one of them outweighs the other one. And you end up with that behavior. Is that a reasonable interpretation? I have no idea. I don't work on this kind of thing. But is it capable of feelings? The difficulty to me is if you say, no, it's not. It's too simple. It doesn't have any feelings whatsoever. Feelings arose later with a more complex central nervous system. And this is too simple a system to be able to have any kind of feelings at all. The whole lot is best explained in terms of an algorithm that is simply a deterministic response to a pheromone, or whatever it may be. Then you're obliged to say, then feelings as we understand them are a property of a central nervous system. and of a sufficient complexity, and therefore it's a property of complex neural networks. It's an emergent property of complex neural networks. In which case, then you're faced with this problem. Okay, so why does this network firing associate with a conscious perception and this one does not?
Yes.
And so we're back to the problem that I framed in the first place, which is that if you try and explain feelings as a property of neural networks, I don't think we're any close to doing it. And it's not just now. You go back to Christoph Koch and Francis Crick in the early 90s, or Edelman before that, talking about the neural correlates of consciousness.
Yeah.
And has that worked? I think the answer is no. We do not have a neural correlate that says this pattern of firing is associated with a feeling or a qualia of this or that or the other. And there was that famous bet with David Chalmers and Christoph Koch about how we'll explain consciousness within 25 years or whatever it was, and that was a couple of years ago. The 25 years was up, and they agreed that we don't know, that we're not there yet. So that is the approach of the correlates of consciousness and the neural networks and so on. I personally think it's the wrong level of analysis, but that then pushes me into the frame where I have to say that an ant is going to have feelings.
Yeah.
Maybe very, very little. They may have been minimized, but there still has to be some perception of its predicament, and that's going to be overwhelmed by the kind of the automated algorithms that say walk in a circle with this pheromone, or kind of things you were saying. But I've got out of this other loop, which is the problem that I don't have to explain feelings as a property of an emergent, an unknown, an almost unknowable property, emergent property of a neural network. I'm explaining it in terms of metabolism and charge.
Yes.
But by my very definition of it, it has to be present in all animals, maybe not sponges, but maybe not plants. I mean, again, a place where I definitely, interestingly, agree with Peter Godfrey Smith, because he would limit it to animals, but also to motility, to the ability to move around, to be able to change your environment. And that's what I was saying about bacteria as well. Power up your flagellum and move over there. I don't think we would be very far apart in that. I think, there isn't a line, there is a continuum.
Yes.
And that continuum is really about, can I act on this set of charges? Those set of charges are inevitable. You poison your environment, you will change your metabolism, you will change your membrane potential. The question is, can you correlate with that something meaningful, and can you do something about it? And I think the only meaningful thing you can do about it is to move.
Yeah.
And that would have agency and consciousness linked with movement. And therefore, again, the necessary prediction of that hypothesis is that plants are not going to be conscious. Even if you can anesthetize them, they're not going to be conscious. So that would put me out of joint with a lot of people who would love to see consciousness as a property of all living things and not the universe. I don't know. I mean, you try and come up with an explanation as a hypothesis, and it forces you into a corner. It forces you to say, okay, well, if this is true, then that has to be untrue, and this can't be right, and so on. And then it's testable, at least.